The self-actualized free will. 1. Some background on the free will versus determinism debate. Let's face it, at the heart of every decision is the concept of good or bad. That means that there are a number of constraints that must be satisfied for a decision to be good. Decisions are usually arrived at after considering facts and opinions and applying heuristics, algorithms, and reasoning. There is also the matter of a goal, or should we say, the goal. Hence, decisions are often, though not always, heavily constrained. Because of the goal, there may only be one way to make the decision. There may only be one good answer. Because of these considerations, we have decided that decisions are not where to fight the battle for free will. Instead, we realized that thoughts and ideas are the true battlefield. We realized that it is possible to have significant external stimuli directing the nature of our thoughts and even internal stimuli, such as our motivation and desires, prodding us in a certain direction, yet be able to freely think about a topic of our choosing and in the way that satisfies our preferences. We see our preferences as a constraint that is absolutely necessary for free will. If we do not satisfy our preferences, what would be the purpose of free will? Two definitions of determinism. A. Every thought, decision, or action is a result of neurobiological processes governed by the laws of chemistry and physics. B. Every brain state is caused by prior brain states in conjunction with sensory inputs, all of which are bound by the deterministic laws of chemistry and physics. 3. Our definition of free will. Free will, in the context of thought processes, refers to the ability of an individual to generate and to entertain thoughts that are not strictly determined by external stimuli, prevailing interests, or personal tendencies other than certain preferences. It is the capacity to conceptualize ideas that might be in opposition to one's immediate circumstances or conditioned patterns of thinking. 4. What we will not do. We will not maintain that the self comes into this world completely unconditioned. 5. What we will do. We will assume that the self comes into this world either by purely physical processes or by processes involving non-physical means. It does not matter to our theory. In either case, the self may be completely determined in the nature of its character, i.e., one does not choose to be who one is prior to the working of the reasoning mind. Whether the mind is different than the brain also bears no relevance to the arguments presented here. To the extent that we will direct arguments against any position, we will direct it against the position of hard determinism. The theory presented here assumes determinism but posits a point of view or goal for free will and a means of accommodating that point of view or goal. 6. What can influence one in a deterministic way? A. Personal history. B. Genetic history. C. The self. D. The mental apparatus itself. The intelligence of the individual is one of the greatest constraints that we know of in this regard, and a nearly fatal weakness of absolute or hard determinism. This is the position of hard determinism. All thoughts and beliefs are the result of neural processes that are deterministic. Therefore, we can conclude that the belief in neural determinism itself is a product of neural processes. Now we can apply the self-reference argument. If one's belief in determinism is the result of deterministic processes, then one's belief is not arrived at by evaluating evidence or reasoning, but by inevitable neural activity. Therefore, if the belief in determinism is not a freely chosen belief but a determined one, then the trust in that belief's validity is undermined. This is because under determinism, one could not have concluded otherwise regardless of the evidence or arguments. Hence, the belief that all thoughts and beliefs are the result of neural processes that are deterministic is irrational by definition. Furthermore, if one argues from natural selection, then one must argue without the benefit of logic or natural selection, because by one's own precept, such things as the concepts of logic and the concept of natural selection cannot be verified or corroborated within such a system. In fact, one must wonder if it would be possible to define determinism in this context. 8. A weakness of our theory. Concerted determinism. The determinism that affects the very engine of thought itself may be the one thing that cannot be overcome. Though we believe that because there is evidence that the biological causation is much weaker than we might think. That there is a gap, as the physicalists might say, that will permit free will in the domain of thought. 9. What are predilections? Predilections are those basic elements that comprise the personality. Part of the predilections are the preferences, which we will define in the next section. Predilections include elements that may have been fashioned by deterministic processes, especially personal history, but may also have been fashioned by free will or even the two together. We generally will refer to predilections in reference to those elements that are to be evaluated by the conscious reasoning mind concerning their relevance to the aims, goals, or interests arising from the preferences. 10. What are the preferences? The preferences may well be the result of deterministic mechanisms. That is fine. But the person must come to grips with who they essentially are and either try to actualize who they are or modify who they are, no matter how they got that way. That is what we all want to be able to do. Now, when I talk of who we are or the self, I mean who we are from birth to approximately 3 years of age. That is what we were born with. At a later age, one would have to ferret out the influences of personal history, as most of us, in fact, will have to do in order to fully apply this theory. We want to find the essence of the person and build on that using the person's own reasoning and thoughts. Consider this. Even if we bring in the concept of God, the soul will still take a particular form that is not necessarily of one's own choosing. We are something, not just anything. We have some predetermined elements. 11. Genetic determinism. Probably the preferences are predetermined in the sense that we, ourselves, had no say in what our preferences are. The preferences are a starting point of our journey. They are the guiding principles that allow each one of us to judge what is in our interest, possibly to know what is right and wrong and what is good and evil. Unless we existed throughout infinity, it would be difficult to see how we could have preferences that were not determined by some process or being. What we will say is that genetic determinism is not all-inclusive enough to account for the preferences. Something more overpowering must account for them. However, genetic determinism may move the needle, so to speak, of the temperament, of the desires and inclinations and so on, even to the degree that they reach opposing territory from their starting points. Yet the effect in all probability is much less than the substrate that genetic determinism operates on. Though the preferences are derived from something in addition to genetic determinism, they are still determined by something other than the self in the view and assumptions of this theory. To present more of an argument to this effect, consider why we all seem to be so different from each other. There can be approximately 2 to the 25,000 possible human genomes. This does include many genomes that would not be viable in a particular environment. But we may expect one person to be different than another, just judging from the huge number of possible genomes. However, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator test recognizes 16 personality types. Myers-Briggs is an influential test for personality. The number of personality types recognized by other such personality tests range from a low of 4 to a high of 16. So, there are trillions upon trillions of possible different people, but only 16 personality types. Now, not all the differences affected by the genomes affect the brain, but many do. In fact, the brain is the object of about half of the 25,000 genes. Thus, the number of genomes that involve differences in the brain must be approximately 2 to the 12,500, still a huge number. Yet there are 16 personality types. What might this tell us? Think of the 12,500 genes as the variables in a function that predicts personality. Thought of in this way, we can conclude that the predictive power of a given gene, or all 2,500 genes, is much less than would be necessary for a completely deterministic scenario. Hence, it would seem that perhaps genetic makeup has a little less to do with the fundamental nature of the brain than we have been led to believe. 12. What are the categories of determinism? A. Random. Random determinism is any causal stimulus that affects the thinking apparatus but does not bias the thought production in a consistent way. This would be especially true of causal stimuli that are not directly related to the thought process. Examples are hunger, fluctuation in dopamine levels, random sense. B. Directed. Directed determinism is any causal stimulus that affects the thinking apparatus and consistently influences thought production in a certain direction. Examples are childhood traumas, the influence of classes taken in school, the effects of peer pressure. C. Concerted. Concerted determinism is the causal stimulus, restriction, or facilitation of thought that is due to the functioning of the mental apparatus itself. Examples are intelligence, the influence of serotonin levels, the ability to plan. 13. What exactly does having freedom of thought and therefore free will look like? A. The goals of freedom of thought or free will. The fundamental usefulness of free will for a modern person is self-determination, and thereby self-fulfillment and purpose. B. How to achieve freedom of thought or free will. Generally, if one does not learn and practice knowing oneself at a deep level, one will be determined to some extent by nature and events. Therefore, most people may be slaves to deterministic effects. But this is the way of almost everything in life. i.e., life has strict requirements but no instruction manual. What we want to do is provide the instruction manual. The exigencies of life probably point us to examination and understanding of the self. Perhaps that is part of the meaning of life. So possibly the average person does manage to throw off the shackles of determinism and become something like his or her true self just because of the realities of life. Yet I agree that many will not. Predilections and precepts arrived at from experience are a good thing to the extent that they are sanctioned by the true nature. The preferences are the true nature in the view of this theory. Now, when I talk of who we are or the self, I mean who we are from birth to approximately 3 years of age. That is what we were born with. We want to find the essence of the person and build on that using one's own reasoning and thoughts. All the preferences of a person could be evil or base. We understand this. In that case, should the person become self-actualized? Self-actualization would be good for the person in that it would satisfy his or her most fundamental desires. Self-actualization is what we all want. But predilections and precepts derived from experience may come to the rescue in such a situation. One such person might reason thus: I have the tendency to do every evil thing according to my preferences. Yet I know that from my experience that to follow the path of my preferences will lead to my punishment, pain, and suffering. Therefore, I choose to resist the preferences and avoid the severe pain that would come to me. Now, this situation would not be ideal from the point of view of the individual involved, because the basic essence of the individual would be denied. However, it might be better for the individual than the alternative. If one is aware of the deterministic influences, then one can reschool one's preferences. Just as one can learn on purpose to eat shrimp and actually like it, one can change one's preferences. The key is to determine what kind of person one is and what kind of person one would like to be. Then the task is to retrain the preferences to become like that person. Genes are not complex enough to determine who a person is. Neither is society. Neither are your parents, your upbringing, or all taken together. One is probably a unique person before they reach 3. Exactly how this works we can only speculate. To what extent it is physical we cannot say. But we do know that who that person is must be discovered and acknowledged. That is done through uncovering one's preferences. However, your personal history leans in a certain direction for each issue or problem at hand. So, one is buffeted toward one direction in your thoughts on a given topic. One must apply as much logic to one's thinking output as one can, and thereby remove any rank prejudice that history produced. Does one's history affect the individual thought production itself? Certainly it can. But if one has become aware of who one is and how the deterministic effects buffet them, it becomes easier to produce thoughts like the ones the self prefers and keep the thinking apparatus on the straight and narrow. In a way, we probably see this self-correction in whole societies from one era to the next. That the self be expressed in its interaction with the world to an appropriate degree is the real issue. The self should be corrected and refined by life on the one hand, but expressed after its refinement on the other, or at least acknowledged and dealt with. With self-knowledge, this is possible as regards history. However, the greatest happiness for most will be to pursue the preferences and to choose routes in life that achieve the expression and goals of the preferences. Against random determinism. Resisting random effects on thought requires that the mind must simply filter the thought product for tendencies that are inappropriate for the subject at hand. Since the effects are random, the effects of random deterministic causes will not be appropriate for most thought processes. Random processes with respect to a given thought event is the way we see definition 2b playing out in most cases, because the atomic or molecular behavior would, for the most part, be entirely divorced from the thought event. Against directed determinism. When there is a direction to the determinism, the individual must recognize the direction that determinism is moving him or her and decide, based on the preferences, the best way to handle the bias. Against concerted determinism, the mental apparatus is determined to some degree, possibly to a great degree. Definition 2a applies here. Neurobiological processes are concerning to our theory. However, the crowning effect of such processes may be the control it seems to weld over the level of intelligence a person has, which is very important generally, but not necessarily to this project. The confluence of the various causes involved in such processes may strangle free will because their influences could impinge on so many facets of the thought processes. Even so, by knowing oneself and by knowing the preferences and the predilections and precepts, one may see where determinism is biasing thought production and work to remedy it. Not always, however. As an example, the hold that deterministic processes have on the brain can act as something other than just a biasing mechanism. Take intelligence, for example. This would seem to be the key deterministic effect, and it is reasonably clear to anyone that there is little an individual can do to negate its effect to the extent that it is not present. There may be other similar effects that one could identify. The following are arguments that various interested professionals could make and our attempted answers concerning our theory of free will. 19. 14. Argument against from the Physicalist. A. The argument. Because all effects result from one or more causes, there simply is no gap in which free will can operate. Therefore, free will is an illusion. B. The answer. Our first answer is to give the self-reference argument and demonstrate the inconsistency of the position. Afterwards, we point out that there are at least 3 classes of causes and that the procedures herein will handle them as far as we have been able to conclude. We await scientific evidence on this issue. 15. Argument against from the theologian. A. The argument. Free will is granted by God and is not constrained as in your theory. B. The response. We are saying that a very satisfactory form of free will is available to most, even if physicalism is entirely true. We are not speculating either way on other possibilities of free will. 16. Argument against from the dualist. A. The argument. Free will is not constrained because the mind is of an entirely different nature than the body or any substance in the physical world. B. The response. The mind is constrained as it presents itself in this physical world. The mind behind the mind may be unconstrained, but we cannot have complete knowledge of it. And so far, we have very little knowledge of it. Free will appears to be constrained in a certain way, without question. We have talked about the constraining effect of intelligence, for example. Now, it may be possible to overcome such a constraint. If so, someone must demonstrate how. But until then, the notion stands that the thought process is constrained. Yet we have free will. 17. Argument against from the neuroscientist. A. The argument. Thoughts and decisions are made microseconds before they appear to the subject and are thus unconscious. Because they are unconscious, there is no real agent producing them. Therefore, free will does not exist. B. The response. Again, absolute determinism is inconsistent with everyday life. If we accept strict determinism, we must forego reasoning in essence. Nevertheless, our theory deals exclusively with the conscious aspects of thought. For random determinism, we can say that, whether the decision is made unconsciously or consciously, the final result will appear in the conscious mind, and it will be clear whether the thought is in accord with the dictates of the preferences. This will also be true for directed determinism. For concerted determinism, the nature of deterministic control is not as clear. But the biases can still be perceived to some extent, and therefore may possibly be reversed. See the empirical experiments that we have suggested to test the theory. 18. Argument against from the psychologist. A. The argument. The thought process is shaped by the physical environment of the brain, the history of the individual, the genetic makeup of the individual, and psychological mechanisms that operate based on individual history and environment. B. The response. All that is true, but we have presented several arguments that the determination coefficients of these variables are somewhat low. There is at least hope that even taken all together, they cannot overwhelmingly determine the individual. Your profession treats the individual by leading him or her to self-discovery, and you believe this has a freeing effect. What we are proposing is very similar. 19. The argument from the Evolutionary Biologist. A. The argument. Natural selection constrains any possible free will. Free will must satisfy the requirements of promotion of survival and promotion of procreation. If it cannot do this, it would be like the body's useless appendix. In other words, it probably wouldn't exist for long in evolutionary time. B. The response. We are, in principle, in agreement. 20. 2 approaches to testing the theory. A. Testing the logical structure. We hope to have discussions concerning this theory with interested parties and thereby uncover weakness in the theory and possibly new avenues of inquiry. As the theory exists now, we have much more to flesh out. B. Empirical testing. Testing this model empirically might involve examining scenarios where each of the 3 kinds of determinism are at play and observing the nature of the thoughts produced. Do people exhibit patterns of thinking that suggest the dominance of one form of determinism over others? Or is there evidence of an independent faculty of thought that could be indicative of free will? A concerted determinism will always be present, but an imaginative experimentalist should be able to vary its amplitude and thus study it. As an example of how one could perform such an experiment, consider that it may be deemed ethical to give the experimental subject caffeine to try to disrupt the normal mode of neural control. Our knowledge of the effects of caffeine may suggest that the addition of caffeine may lead to more rapid idea generation, less originality of ideas, and less depth of thought. Construct an experiment in which one has the subject first think about subject A and later about a similarly compelling subject B, both based upon the preferences of the subject as determined through self-reports and previous psychological testing. Psychological testing for those who have not gone through self-awareness training, and a mixture of psychological testing and self-report for those who have. Compare the subject when under the influence of caffeine and when not under the influence of caffeine against the effects expected for the respective thoughts. Empirical testing should include a test in which subjects are coached in developing self-awareness and self-knowledge, and then ideation or thought output is compared between the groups who have been coached and those who have not been coached. In those who have been coached, there may be a test of the degree to which each subject is able to practice self-knowledge and self-awareness by comparing certain psychologically well-defined and testable syndromes or attributes to the subject's self-report or other test results. 1. Conclusion. We conclude that free will exists in the realm of thought and ideas. We acknowledge that looking for free will in the realm of decisions is probably not fruitful because decisions are constrained by nature in most cases. We have discussed the role of the most basic nature or essence of the person involved in the attempt to become somewhat free of deterministic influences, that is, the preferences. We concluded that the preferences are to be refined and expressed. The only case in which we concluded that another path would be better was the case where the preference was base or evil. In that case, we suggested that use of history and learning could allow the person to retrain the preferences, at least to some extent. While genetics, personal history, and a number of other factors represent potential causes that could influence the person, they do not exclusively define the person's thought processes. We provided arguments that genetics probably does not have the capacity to construct deterministic prisons for the mind. There seems to be room for free thought. We gave an argument that seems compelling against hard determinism. At the same time, we provided a more direct demonstration of our thesis concerning free will. We have submitted the thesis that the preferences are determined. At the same time, we have stated that discovering and embracing the preferences can lead to self-actualization and freedom of the thought life, i.e., the exhibiting of free will. We argue that the person must engage with the preferences, refine them as necessary, and express them by letting them inform the thought life. All the while, the person must be self-aware and employ critical reasoning. We didn't define it in the argument, but we will define it now. The gap that every free will advocate is looking for is the detection of the noise brought on by deterministic factors. Philosophically, whose voices do we hear? We know that Jean-Paul Sartre taught self-actualization and personal choice. Aristotle taught the cultivation of virtue in accord with one's essence. But perhaps Socrates most of all, he taught the importance of self-knowledge and the importance of questioning one's beliefs to reveal the true bedrock. Perhaps we have come full circle.